right? And to the degree to which we bow down and allow ourselves to be influenced by feminism, we as men will never be able to take responsibility for the things God has given us charge over. My name is Lennox Kelefungwa, and this is Ordinary Gentlemen, where we endeavor to master the arts of masculinity by building the virtues of strength, wisdom, and responsibility for the glory of God. Welcome back for another episode, gentlemen. I'm very excited to talk about our subject today, which is responsibility. What does it mean for a man to be responsible? As the Ordinary Gentleman, we like to speak about mastering the art of masculinity by building the virtues of strength, wisdom, and responsibility. So what do we mean when we say men ought to be responsible? What does it look like when a man assumes responsibility? That's a question that we all need to be asking and have a very clear answer to. So let's begin by defining what responsibility is. What is responsibility? Well, responsibility is the good stewardship of the gifts and callings we have been given by God. Responsibility is the good stewardship of the gifts and callings we have been given by God. And by good stewardship, what we're talking about here is basically nurturing, taking care of, developing, and building whatever it is that God has placed in our hands. Whether it's the relationships we have in our life, whether it's some material resource that we have been given, we are called to nurture, develop, preserve, and take care of the things that God has given us. So responsibility begins with us understanding what good stewardship means. God has given us a mandate to be those who subdue and dominate the earth. We're not destroyers of the earth, we're developers of the earth, we're builders of the earth, right? And that can refer to all kinds of things in our lives. What is it that we are seeking to develop? What is it that we're seeking to grow? What is it that we're seeking to build? And as we do this duty of building, developing, preserving, we're actually practicing what is known as good stewardship. And it's important for us to understand that that's where responsibility begins. It begins with us recognizing who we are as men, right? We are supposed to be good stewards, right? Because ultimately, all things belong to God. Christ, God, is sovereign over all things, and we're called to be stewards of the things that He gives to us. But it's also important for us to actually emphasize the fact that He's the one who calls us to this task to be good stewards. That's where this all begins. Since we're made in the image of God and He has assigned us a very specific responsibility as men, we need to be good stewards of the things that God has given us to take care of. Right? So remember that definition. Responsibility is the good stewardship of the gifts and callings that have been given us by God. Let's keep that in mind. But in order for us to appreciate how we can apply responsibility, we need to recognize the fact that God has assigned us a duty as men, right? If we don't know what we've been assigned to, if we don't know what our duty is, it'll be very difficult for us to take responsibility for what we've been called to do. So what are men called to do? Well, men, very simply, are called to be the protectors, the providers, and presiders over families, churches, and society at large. And in those spaces, we exercise strength, wisdom, and responsibility as tools to that end, right? So men are protectors, providers, and presiders over their families, churches, and society at large. God has called us to lead in these places. God has called us to protect in these places. God has called us to provide in these places. This is fundamentally what men are for. Men are builders of families, churches, and societies. And strength, wisdom, and responsibility, which is what we're looking at today, are very key ingredients that go towards us being exactly what God has called us to be. This is what the duty of a man is: to protect, to provide, and to preside over families, over churches, and over society. And it is worth mentioning as well that we're called to do these things in our individual lives as well, right? We ought to be investing in ourselves. We ought to be taking responsibility for ourselves as well as men, right? If we can't master ourselves, how are we going to be able to lead our families, lead our churches, lead our communities? All right, so this is very important for us to recognize our duty as men. Without this duty, without a knowledge of this duty, it'll be impossible for us to assume responsibility for it. The next thing I want to say regarding responsibility is that it involves us taking ownership of things, right? Taking personal ownership of things. Responsibility is not something that ought to be relegated or necessarily delegated to another person. Responsibility is something that we ought to own. We ought to take personal ownership of the things that we have been called to do. One of the things that we ought to take personal ownership over is our personal well-being, right? We're called to nurture our bodies. We're called to nurture our minds. We're called to nurture our souls. That's where it begins. Now, if we don't take ownership of this and we continue to defer this responsibility to others, we can't really say that we're going to get the outcomes we so desire, right? True growth begins with us being able to take responsibility for ourselves, right? It's not someone else's responsibility to make sure that your body is strong as a man, that your body is healthy. It's not someone else's responsibility to ensure that you are growing spiritually. Now, God has placed authorities in our lives like church leaders or fathers who are called to be nurturing our souls, nurturing our spiritual lives. But we have to be the ones who take real responsibility for our own growth. We have to be the ones who place ourselves under authority in order for us to grow. We have to be the ones who take ownership of the fact that it's on us to open up books to read and learn, to be diligent in the study of the word, be diligent in communing with other like-minded Christians who can help you grow and develop. We are responsible for that. We're responsible for making sure we're going to the gym week in, week out. That's on us, right? We're the ones who essentially need to take responsibility for everything that's in our care, beginning with our personal lives, our personal well-being. The next thing I want to say is that we need to be taking ownership of our homes. Now, I did say earlier on that men were called to provide and to protect and to preside over our families, churches, and societies, right? Now, this is very important for us to understand because church and society is very dependent on the family. If the family breaks down, so does the church, so does society. And so as men, we need to make sure that we are providing and protecting in our homes, providing financially, providing in a material sense in that regard, providing spiritually, providing intellectually, providing everything. As men, we're not just people who, we like to sometimes think that provision is exclusively in terms of financial provision, right? But provision is actually holistic. Provision is something we ought to be doing in a holistic sense. We ought to be providing for all the faculties of our children and wife's being. We need to be investing in their minds, investing in their hearts, investing in their bodies as well, making sure that they are physically healthy and strong. Right? This is what it means. We're to be protectors as well of our families. This means protection from physical harm, also protection from false doctrines, protection from a host of things. Whatever it is that wars against the family, as men, we are called to be protectors of our families. So that's very important for us to understand. But I also think this involves very specifically building marriages. Right? We need to be taking ownership of our marriages. And marriage is probably one of those institutions where our selfishness is most easily seen, most easily recognized. We see it. And it's so easy for us to put blame on our spouses, on our wives, for why our marriages are dysfunctional. But you can't really do much to change your spouse. You can't really do much to change your wife. What you can do is take responsibility for yourself. And as you develop yourself and grow yourself, right, taking ownership for your own duty within your marriage, making sure we're loving our wives as Christ loved the church, then I believe God will use our faithfulness to bless our marriages, right? We ought to take responsibility for ourselves. And in so doing, we're also demonstrating to our wives what it looks like when we take ownership, when we take responsibility for our duty that goes towards building a healthy marriage. It's also important for us to recognize that we need to take ownership of our children's development. Right? The Bible tells us that we ought to be raising our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. This is not someone else's responsibility to do. This is our responsibility as men to do. We need to take ownership of the hearts, minds, and souls of our children, nurturing them, investing in them, making sure that they are doing well in a holistic sense. So, men, this is on us to take responsibility for. No one else is going to do this for us, right? At the end of the day, God is going to hold us accountable for what we did in our homes, how we loved our wives, and how we raised our children. Keep that in mind. Another thing I want to say is we ought to be taking personal ownership of our vocations. Work is something that God has given us for the purpose of building culture for His glory. Work is a glorious, it's a wonderful, it's an amazing institution. It's an amazing idea that God has given us. The idea of vocation is a very idea that God set in place for us to build culture. What an amazing thing. But we need to keep in mind that we ought to take ownership of our work. Right? This is not something we ought to defer to someone else to do. We ought to take responsibility for making sure that our work is done rightly. A model that I like to think of in my own life is how through my work, I want to propagate truth, beauty, and goodness in everything that I do. Right? That's on me. That's on me to know what the truth is, to know what it means for something to be beautiful, to know what good is. Right? That's on me to develop. That's on me to take ownership of. And as we take ownership of the fact that we are called to do work that is honest, to do work that is excellent, to do work that is righteous, when we understand that that's on us to do, I think that changes everything, right? So we're not just working because we're trying to please someone else or because we're just trying to check off someone else's responsibility. Work is our responsibility as men. So to what degree can you say that you have owned your vocation, that you have owned developing your skill set, that you have owned wanting to propagate truth, beauty, and goodness through your vocation? Those are important questions to ask. Another thing worth mentioning is that we ought to be taking responsibility or ownership over our living spaces and our personal belongings. It's so easy for us to be so, especially that we live in such a consumerist culture, we can think of ourselves as consumers and nothing else. All right, we need to recognize that the things that God has given us, even for enjoyment, are things that ought to be taken care of. Again, can you say that the things that God has placed in your care are things that are bearing fruit? Right? One way that we can actually tell that someone is not taking ownership and responsibility for something is if fruit is lacking from their use of whatever it is that God has given. All right, so can you say that you are taking ownership of your living spaces? Can you say that the places you inhabit are clean? Can you say that they communicate, even in that space, truth, beauty, and goodness? Can you say that your workspace communicates truth, beauty, and goodness? Can you say that your homes, in the way that they aesthetically look, communicate truth, beauty, and goodness? Can you say that the gadgets you use communicate that you are using truth, beauty, and goodness as a model to take charge and to take ownership, to take care of the things that you have been given? Right, this is important for us to understand, that we ought to take responsibility for our living spaces and our personal belongings. Another thing I want to mention is that we ought to be taking ownership of our communities. Remember how I spoke about how a man ought to be a protector, provider, and presider over society, right? We had mentioned the family, we had mentioned the church, but also over society. Now, there's very tangible ways that we can be involved in our communities. Look at the people around you that need to be served. Look at what needs to be fixed in your community and try to get yourself involved, right? Rally other men in the community to do your duty. Might be providing security for your community. Could be a variety of things. But it's important that we take ownership of our community. Sometimes this is something we like to defer to others, right? But responsibility is something that we should own for ourselves with regard to our communities. Another thing I want to mention here is churches as well, right? We ought to take responsibility and ownership for our churches. This is not something, again, that is just relegated to elders and deacons and church leaders at large, right? This is something we ought to take responsibility for, right? What is the condition with regard to the health of your church, right? That's a good place to start. And then answering the question, what can I do to meet the needs of my church? What can I do to step up as a man in my church? These are very important questions to ask. The health of your church very much depends on you doing your faithful duty. That begins with you taking ownership of your church. Another thing that's worth mentioning with regard to taking ownership is the idea of taking ownership of our sins and mistakes. Now, it's true that each and every one of us struggles with sin. Sin is something that's just a part of our nature, right? By the grace of God, He enables us to live lives that are pleasing to Him. However, sin is something we're going to have to continue battling in our lives. Now, the thing is, we can't really seek freedom from sin or really experience freedom from sin without us first taking responsibility for our sin. Right? Of course, that begins with us acknowledging that we have fallen short, that we are in fact sinful, that we are in fact in need of help. Right? And so, to the degree to which we can grow out of our sin, we need to be able to take responsibility and ownership of our sin, and take ownership of our need to grow out of our sin. Right? And that has to do with ownership. There's a few other things I want to say with regard to what it means for a man to take responsibility. And one of the things I want to talk about is the things that constantly war against our calling to be responsible. And one of the things I wanted to mention was statism and overdependence. Now, we live in a world in which we believe the government presides over everything, right? We believe government should be providing education. We believe the government should be providing healthcare and all kinds of welfare, right? And I think that has created overdependence even in men, where we think it's the government's responsibility to make sure that our families are well taken care of. We think it's the government's responsibility to make sure that our communities are well taken care of. And in some cases, we even think it's the government's responsibility to make sure our churches are well taken care of, right? But even at a more personal level, we sometimes believe it's the government's responsibility to make sure that we're individually taken care of. Right? And that's catastrophic. I think that has been one of the things that the world has used to emasculate men. So statism and an over-dependence on the government for everything is actually terrible for men. It emasculates men. It weakens and neuters men. Right? And to the degree to which we're over-dependent on the state in this regard, we will continue to be men who struggle to take responsibility for the things that God has given us to take care of. Another thing that's worth mentioning, considering what things war against men taking responsibility, is feminism. Right? We've talked about feminism on this channel before, and feminism is one of those ideas that is designed to undermine the idea of patriarchy. It's designed to undermine masculinity. It's designed to wreck society and to cause chaos, right? And to the degree to which we bow down and allow ourselves to be influenced by feminism, we as men will never be able to take responsibility for the things God has given us charge over. Another thing that's worth mentioning regarding the things that war against responsible men is our own ignorance. Sometimes as men, we don't know what it is we're supposed to be doing. We're not even sure what it is to be a man, right? We don't really know what the duty of a man is. We don't know what it means for a man to live in this world and be fruitful. And so our own ignorance does us a great disservice. For as long as we remain ignorant, we can't really take responsibility in the way we need to be taking responsibility. The last thing I want to say regarding the things that war against a man's calling to be responsible is fear. So many men are ruled by fear. And fear is crippling. It really is. You'll never find fruit from fear. Fear never produces fruit. Keep that in mind. There's a great friend of mine who has been a mentor to me over the years who likes to remind me that fear is essentially faith in the enemy. That's what it is. Fear is faith in the enemy. The Bible calls us to fear God alone. And in fearing God alone, we actually find freedom. Freedom to do everything that we're supposed to do. Fear is enslaving, right? Freedom allows us to assume responsibility in the way we need to in order for us to bear fruit in every area of our lives, right? So kill that fear, man, and pursue freedom that is only found in God. Now, as we begin to wind up, I just want to speak about what responsibility requires. I think there are some things that we need to be nurturing in our lives that will allow us, that will enable us to take responsibility in the way we need to be taking responsibility. And the first thing I want to mention is humility. We need to recognize first and foremost that our lives belong to God and He sets the terms of our service to Him. That requires us to be humble and acknowledge the fact that He is sovereign and we are not. He is king and we are not. We are actually sinners in need of His mercy and grace. We need His help and we need His rescue. We need His grace. Right? And so in posturing ourselves before God rightly, we are exercising humility, putting us in the best position to now take responsibility in the way that God intended for us. The second thing I want to say is that responsibility is going to require us to be honest. We're going to have to be honest about a variety of things. Right? First, we need to be those who know what the truth is. We live in a world that doesn't like the idea of truth. At least they don't like the idea of an absolute truth. We live in a world that loves this idea of a subjective truth. What's true for me doesn't have to be true for you. What's true for you doesn't have to be true for me. That is an attack on truth itself. And without truth, there's really not much to take responsibility for. And so the anchor of responsibility in that sense, in a lot of ways, is actually truth. But we also need to recognize that in our embrace of truth, that means that we should be seeking to be honest in all areas of our lives, speaking the truth to others, owning our mistakes whenever we fall into sin, all right? And actually taking ownership of that enables us to then grow, right? So responsibility requires honesty. Another thing that responsibility requires is courage. It really does require courage. You know how we spoke a moment ago about how fear is a detractor to us taking responsibility. So in killing that fear, we need to be pursuing courage, pursuing stepping up and doing the right thing, even in the face of adversity. Even if it might make you unpopular, you step up and you do your duty and you do it courageously. And the last thing I want to say regarding what responsibility requires is discipline. Jocko Willink, some of you may know him, likes to say that discipline equals freedom. And I'm inclined to agree with him. Discipline is us being able to remain consistent in our duty, making sure that we're never compromising in our daily, weekly, annual duties, making sure that we're always pursuing fruit in every single area of our lives with a very focused disposition. Discipline is essential for us to be free. Discipline is essential for us to actually be men who are going to take responsibility. And so, man, thank you so much for listening to this episode. And I pray that each and every one of us will become responsible men. And may God find us faithful rather than wanting.